Okay, I'll give it a few minutes. We're just waiting for everybody to enter the room and then we'll get started. Maybe one more minute.
Maybe while we are waiting, I could welcome everyone in the name of Maya Living Legacy and announce our forthcoming talks.
I think that
Uh,
sounds great, Kata.
yes,
Let's go.
so I already started doing that while we are waiting for you to introduce Traci today. So just wanted to let you guys know, everybody who is in the room, that um, we will have a very exciting series of talks still in March and April. There will be a conversation in Spanish with Mayan, probably one of the most renowned writers, Jorge Miguel Cocompech. So all of you who speak Spanish and are interested in the significance of dreams in Maya culture are welcome to join in Spanish. And then there will be two lectures in English, um, one on Maya health, plants, and different concepts of psychology and body by Deira Jimenez on April, I think April 18th. And on April 11th, a lecture by Charles Picot on Maya literary renaissance, this phenomenon of reviving Maya culture after Maya alphabet has been codified in 1984. And there is one more lecture by a linguist that is on, do you remember that one? Because it's kind of escaping me.
I don't, unfortunately.
Well, so we also have one more
That one's, I believe,
lecture
is on the 22nd.
focused on linguistics for all of you who major in linguistics or are interested in Maya linguistics. So please follow our forthcoming lectures.
Thank you, Kata. All right, well, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. This lecture is part of our Maya Living Legacy series that has gone on for this academic year. And as Kata mentioned, we've got some exciting talks coming up. Today, we're delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Traci Ardren, who's joining us from the University of Miami. And I'll say some more words of introduction about Dr. Ardren momentarily, but before we get started, I just would like to share our land acknowledgement statement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk, a place their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. And today we respect the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. All right. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Traci Ardren. Dr. Ardren is an archaeologist who is professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Miami, and is a recipient of their Cooper Fellowship, which recognizes and rewards faculty members for excellence in scholarship, teaching, and service. Her research engages diverse themes, including the archaeological traces of everyday life, social identities and their symbolic representation, the social uses of food beyond diet, and the role of cuisine in identity formation and community building, as well as the intersection between culinary tourism and modern foodways. As a specialist in Mesoamerican archaeology, Dr. Ardren has conducted extensive field research in the Maya lowlands, particularly at the classic period site of Yaxuna in Yucatan, Mexico. Beyond Mesoamerica, she directs the Matecumbe Project, which investigates the political organization and environmental adaptation of the pre-Hispanic occupants of the Florida Keys. She has authored and edited several books that represent significant contributions to anthropological scholarship concerning the Maya. These include Social Identities in the Classic Maya Northern Lowlands, Gender, Age, Memory, and Place, Her Cup for Sweet Cacao, Food in Ancient Maya Society, The Maya World, and most recently, Everyday Life in the Classic Maya World, in which she explores the experiences and activities of people across diverse arenas, as well as less studied social groups, including children and elders. Today, she'll share some of her recent research concerning classic period Maya queens. Her talk is titled Family Politics, Harnessing Female Sexuality and Dynastic Reproduction in the Lives of Classic Period Maya Queens. Let's give her a very warm welcome.
I'm just going to, I just stopped that for a second so that I could, well, I don't know how to make myself show up here exactly. Well, I was going to try, here we go. Sorry. Just say hi to everybody. Here we are. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really excited to share this information about research. I've been working on Maya Queens for ages and ages, it seems like, since I was an undergrad, actually, and I became interested in Maya culture, and then in women's roles in Maya culture, and then in Maya classic period Maya art. And so I have been thinking about this for a very long time, and recently published a chapter-length piece on classic Maya queens, from which this talk is taken. So I've had to leave out little bits and pieces, but if you are interested in more, you can find that in this Faces of Rulership in the Maya Region book. I can always send the PDF to Dr. Clayton or anybody else, or you can look at the whole volume. Okay, so let's get started. And although I'm going to read my talk, I want you to know that you can interrupt me at any time if you have a question, or we can save those to the end, whatever you prefer. Scholars have often found it challenging to define the unique power of a queen. One solution is to understand the queen as an honorary man, especially when she holds what scholars commonly consider masculine titles. This solution suggests that power is masculine by definition, an assumption that rarely survives careful analysis in pre-Hispanic cultures of the New World. In the case of the ancient or classic period Maya, and I'm referring to the period from 200 to 900 of the Common Era, the solution has often been to overlook the sizable evidence for the institution of queenship and instead focus on the biographical details of select queens and their progeny. While individual royal or noble women have long been identified through epigraphic decipherment or tomb excavations, their institutional role in the Maya monarchy is generally poorly understood. This study presents an exploration of the nature of indigenous Maya elite female power during the classic period and considers how it is implicated in the office of formal queenship, exploring the ambiguities and paradoxes that emerge when the capacities of particular historical women are compared to what we know about classic Maya power structures. Gender constructions were embedded in other social hierarchies during the classic period, and precisely because gender conceptions were not stable or static over time, the rights and obligations of royal women were manipulated by the women themselves and by the centripetal forces of royal dynasties to maintain and monopolize power. Maya queens of the classic period were both secular authorities responsible for the protection of their polity and palace, and divine authorities responsible for the recreation of the fertile world. Their experiences were varied at different urban centers, but the idealized representations that they left behind allow us to grasp the profound role they played in elite culture and politics. By idealized representations, I mean things like this rollout vessel. This is a cylindrical vessel that has been photographed in rollout form, and these objects were exchanged between elites, royals, during the classic period. And they're very rich in information for us about the court and the more or less 1%. Some queens held formal titles and were invested via political ritual, while other queens were known as such through their relationships to power-holding men. This diversity is to be expected in the study of queenship and is fundamentally shaped by the incomplete nature of the data available to us. This study asks how indigenous Maya conceptualizations of gendered power contributed to the mechanisms of the state. Queens exercise power within structural power systems. How were the systems constituted? How did state-sponsored art and mythology control elite female sexuality to ensure succession? Why were queens essential to Maya rulership? This chapter situates Maya queens within a framework informed by recent scholarship on queenship worldwide and the role of women within the institution of monarchy. A fundamental precept of this scholarship is that royal women were part of the monarchy, not merely accessories. Female patronage was essential to sustaining a dynasty, as was the loyalty royal women generated through rituals and events at the heart of classic Maya culture. Women's roles were shaped by the nature of specific monarchic institutions, for which the classic Maya in the classic Maya case included competing dynastic lineages with supernatural origins that were governed by patrilineal descent. We have three major bodies of data from which to reconstruct the lives of ancient Maya queens and in which to see the patterns that emerge based on the institutional roles they played. We have hieroglyphic inscriptions, which emphasize kin relations and spiritual actions, tomb furniture, and treatments, which emphasize the idealized productive activities of Maya queens, and elite art, which emphasizes ritual activities essential to the reproduction of the state. Epigraphic data from the classic period suggests that three basic categories of royal Maya women can be subsumed by the word queen, which has a confounding number of meanings in modern English. Many royal women embodied more than one of these roles, and as such, they had access to multiple avenues of power and influence. The most common and variable role included women who were mothers or wives of Maya rulers. A less common, but more authoritative role included women who co-ruled with men, sometimes as regents for young sons, but also as co-rulers with their husbands. Many of these women carried the royal hau title or ruler title during their lifetimes. The final role consisted of those queens who carried the ahau title and ruled independently as queens. 16 Maya queens from the 4th through the 8th century across the southern lowlands are known to have held the supreme Kalamte title during the classic period. Nearly 14% of all individuals who are known to carry this title, which carried with it the meaning of supreme or independent authoritarian rule. This is a strong demonstration that at the height of the classic period, certain royal women from across the lowlands were understood to embody the ultimate demonstration of diplomatic and political power. It's important to note that there is no Maya word for queen or king. Power and authority were conveyed through titles, and the same titles were used by both male and female royals, although women's names were marked by a particular prefix. As Liz James writes in her exploration of Byzantine medieval queens, titles are not the icing on the cake, but the essence of government. There was a unified system of title across the Maya lowlands, and while titles indicate status rather than political office, they are a clear indication of the indigenous system of hierarchical access to power and rank. Here's a Kalamte title. Sorry, I forgot to show you that. So in other words, 14% of the people, all people who carried the Kalamte title were women. And that's, of course, in the hieroglyphic corpus that we have today. We don't know exactly how much of that corpus we've lost or other things that would have affected the sample, but still it's a sizable number of people. And that title is independent supreme authority. Any study of Maya queens and indigenous female authority structures is situated within the ongoing evolution of Maya conceptualizations of gender as an access of power. Maya queenship remains an evolving and salient cultural phenomenon at pageants held across Guatemala, where young women are elected as cultural ambassadors. This study responds to a call by indigenous feminists to address the long-term effects of colonialism by paying closer attention to the ways in which indigenous women of the past shared power with men and the heterogeneous lives that those women led. As Devin Masuas argues, the past impacts the present. And, quote, knowing tribal traditions, including women's place in them, can help modern natives cope with a complex and impersonal world by offering foundations to form their identities and to create strategies for dealing with diversity, end quote. Research on Native women that is nuanced and does not homogenize Indigenous cultures into a single stereotype is consistent with feminist approaches to social science, in which the social and political nature of the archaeological enterprise is acknowledged. Native women have been erased from the dominant historical narratives created by settler colonial society, and their voices are still muted today, as an epidemic of violence against Native women rages through the New World. In our own way, until very recently, Mayanists have erased the institution of Maya queenship from our popular and scholarly interpretations of the Maya past, which damages not only Native history, but also the scholarly understanding of Maya structural expressions of power. Native scholars such as Shannon Speed point out how the vulnerability of Native women today is tied directly to a structural condition imposed upon them in multiple and intersecting ways through structures of settler capitalist power, one of which is the production of historical narratives. By working carefully to see Indigenous principles at work and by taking the reception of our research by Native people seriously, we can hope to remove our own embedded frameworks of masculinist and capitalist power structures from our reconstructions of the past and to reveal other ways of constructing authority. As a white woman writing about Native culture, I take the advice of Masuas very seriously. My writing must not only educate non-natives about Native culture, but also must be inspiring and educational to Native people. This is a rollout of what we believe to be a scene of marriage alliances, that the two princesses on the right-hand side of your screen are being carried into a royal court where discussion of their future marriage will take place. Patrilineal descent groups around the world and throughout history emphasize exogamy or marriage outside the group and patriline. This is largely the result of competition between related male siblings for the resources available to their generation. It may also be why men were so heavily invested in negotiating marriage alliances for their royal daughters within the classic Maya world. By leaving their homes, these women were no longer a draw on the material resources of the patriline, which were controlled by its male members and their unmarried sisters. Although such women would always remain a member of their father's patriline, when transferred from their home of origin to the home of their husband's patriline, they no longer could expect daily access to patriline material resources and instead had to negotiate for their needs within their new household of unrelated men and women. For example, a queen who moved from one classic Maya polity to another for marriage resided in the household of her husband, but belonged to the lineage and spiritual resource group of her father. Being physically separated did not necessarily mean forfeiting a social membership in her patrilineage, especially in matters of inheritance, of spiritual knowledge, and ancestral contact. In fact, it is likely that marriage alliances were predicated on the ability of a royal woman to maintain membership in her birth patriline and her relationships with her birth kin. In the hieroglyphic record, and this is an object known by many names. We'll just call it La Corona Panel 6 here. It's now in the Dallas Museum of Art. It shows rituals being done by women who we know traveled from a distant polity to marry into La Corona. So they were part of these marriage alliances. In the hieroglyphic record, marriage alliances of high status women to lower status men are common. In these cases, the woman's birth patriline plays a crucial role in her reception and her new home. Likewise, when we see the marriage of a royal woman from a subjugated polity to her overlord, the woman functions as an object for the ongoing humiliation of her patriline. Ritual knowledge and ceremonial skills acquired from ancestors as a member of a patriline were clearly needed by a woman who left her home, as we commonly see them commemorated in their new homes for their successful period-ending rites or deity conjurations. And crucially, queens represented the promise that such ancestors, patron gods, ritual knowledge, and skills would be passed to her husband's child. Polygyny likely provided greater protection for those royal women who could not or did not wished to reproduce, and meshed as they were within a royal court where their sister wives would likely bear heirs. In cities with a history of polygynous marriage, and this Yaxchilan is one of those, such as Yaxchilan, we see the material record reflect aspects of female royal power other than motherhood and dynastic succession. These may have been some of the very few contexts where royal women were able to dedicate their lives to politics, ritual, or art without fear of banishment for their lack of offspring. It is important to consider the practice of polygyny as structurally advantageous to a patrilineal descent system that vested power in lineal continuity. We'll see that the control of female sexuality was a serious concern within Maya mythology of the classic period, but this must be framed within the state-sponsored principles of a strict patrilineal succession model. Mythology of the classic period, as depicted on painted vases and pots, as well as in hieroglyphic texts, conveys state values and thus the importance of patrilineal succession as a basis for the orderly transfer of power. State rules of descent must be understood to be distinct from actual patterns of behavior, a fact well established in the global history of monarchies. Now that I have briefly described the structural relations of patrilineal kinship, and in the article I do a much longer discussion of that, as well as explaining patrilocal residence and polygynous marriage, we'll now I'm going to talk a little bit about classic Maya mythology as a form of social reproduction that structured many of the options available to Maya queens and underscored their claims to authority. One basis for understanding the composition of Maya monarchy is the concept of gender complementarity, which not only structured the depictions of male and female interactions within ancient Maya culture, but also influenced how dynastic power was constructed and shared. A profound reliance upon the concept of complementary male and female productive roles is a consistent characteristic of ancient, historic, and modern Maya culture. As Rosemary Joyce noted for the classic Maya, the figures depicted in monuments offer a clear image of heterosexual adult gender performance that was simultaneously a precedent for the enactment of noble status and public formality. And here's just one of many examples where you see women and men paired and doing a ritual together simultaneously. They appear to be of equal status. There are a number of examples like this in the corpus of ceramic pots as well as in carved stela. Complementarity, which is a principle that enlarges the social body of a single ruler into an ideal of completion, is communicated via the paired images of kings and queens on twin stelae at sites such as Calakmul, Yaxchilan, and Koba, as well as on many elite ceramic vases. The equivalency of wealth seen in the royal burials of both male and female elites is further demonstration of this principle, as are royal parentage statements that conventionally mention both maternal and paternal lineages. Within the corpus of elite material culture available today, there's a relatively consistent communication of this principle. Ideological complementarity does not preclude gender hierarchy. While mutuality has undergone tremendous challenges and modifications in its expression, both during the colonial period, when Spanish administrations instituted female subjugation, and within recent times, when out-migration changed the domestic gender dynamic toward female self-reliance, an ideology of gender complementarity exists in much of the modern Maya world alongside a hierarchical structure that privileges men. As with the Aztec, elite Maya women did not share a social equality with men during the classic period. The majority of sovereigns and administrators were male, and classic Maya art as a whole is dominated by the male-male gaze toward a youthful male body. Complementarity also does not preclude the existence of non-binary gender roles and expectations, which are hinted at in certain cave art and intoxication scenes, both of which depict male homosocial events with a fluidity of bodily contact. Clowns, jesters, dwarves, and other performers are often depicted in a manner that de-emphasizes gender as an identifying characteristic in favor of other types of legitimizing scripts and cues. We also see ambitious queens who utilize the gender ambiguous imagery of the maize deity to uphold their power. The maize deity is an active sexual being who usually epitomizes the ideals of classic Maya beauty and youth. In Oswaldo Chinchilla's reading of Maya mythology, the maize deity embodies the magnetism of youthful sexuality, with all its fertile potential for bringing rain, ensuring crops, and perpetuating life. Yet sexuality is also a source of danger and potential pollution, a force which must be controlled in order to avoid overindulgence and ruin. Mesoamerican mythology is full of encounters with overly sexed women who lure men into danger and death. While it is easy to see such myths as providing a script for the strict control of female sexual behavior, such stories also reveal an acknowledgement of the profound and formidable power of female sexuality as a force of both creation and destruction. The young women who dress and care for the maize deity and ultimately lead him to death, and here are two depictions of that mythological cycle, are so beautiful as to be dangerous. And they simultaneously represent the danger of sexual attraction as well as its absolute necessity. As in other Mesoamerican traditions, this mythology serves to reinforce the state's control over not only women, but also appropriate forms of reproduction. The overt sexual power or potential of royal women is also present in mythological scenes where young and beautiful royal women interact with various avatars of the sun god, shown primarily on classic period ceramic vases. In this mythological cycle, a carefully guarded young woman is seduced by a roguish male hero in disguise, and their dalliance results in her impregnation. Perhaps best known in the story of Shkik, the mother of the hero twins in the Popol Vuh, Chinchilla also suggests the same theme of fear, acknowledgement of female fertile potential is depicted on many classic period vases. Chinchilla suggests that there's a strong parallel between Shkik and Xochiquetzal, the Aztec, as first noted by 18th century priest Francisco Jimenez, and explains that they were both sexually alluring young goddesses who trespassed prohibitions involving movement from home, as well as magical trees. They both mothered important gods, and their plight gave way to major cosmological events. This story also touches on the themes of female sexuality and its powers of creation by acknowledging a woman's ability to step outside the tightly prescribed rules of procreation and seize control of generational succession away from the state. In classic iconography, this young woman is the moon goddess, who is often depicted with an older male deity, perhaps her father or creator god, like Itzamna. On one classic period vase, the one we're looking at, a young male figure on the left side of the scene is shown with a beak poking through a flower, perhaps a mask meant to give him the appearance of a hummingbird, which is a common avatar of the sun god, while the young woman is protected by an older male deity. Hilda Delgado suggests that the common figurines that depict elite Maya women weaving with a bird perched on their loom are an iteration of this same mythological theme, this time with the suitor disguised as a bird and weaving as a well-known trope for sexual intercourse within Maya culture. Domesticated female sexuality, harnessed in service to the patriline and thus to the controlled reproduction of the state, is also the topic of many classic period portraits of royal women. The rituals performed by royal women on the Yaxchilan panels, for example, this is probably one of the best known images of a Maya woman. These have long been understood to record women conjuring what have been called vision serpents or ancestral spirits. On the La Corona panel 6, 3 queens of the Kanul kingdom are engaged in ritually opening a portal to unleash their ancestral spirits. There's a strong argument to be made that it was what is often depicted as a vision serpent shares characteristics with the supernatural centipede. Serpents and centipedes being creatures associated with the earth, fecundity, and maternity in Mesoamerican mythology. And on this image of a queen, you can see her conjuring, she's holding a ceremonial bar, she's conjuring this supernatural centipede or serpent. As powerful poisonous creatures, they embody the ambiguity with which indigenous Mesoamerican people viewed sexuality as a necessary and pleasurable force that was likewise dangerous and even ruinous if left uncontrolled. The sexual act not only brought fertility and reign, but also unchecked license and unsanctioned reproduction. The epigraphic phrase conjuring kawil seems to be a possible metaphor for the politicized and ritualized act of reproduction. The conjuration of kawil was a ritual recorded in many of the inscriptions accompanying queenly portraits, and this deity is known to have strong connections to dynastic legitimacy. Perhaps what scholars have long described as a high-ranking queen's ability to, quote, improve the bloodline of her less politically powerful home, as in the history of Yaxchilan, La Corona, Naranjo, and Coba, among others, is an acknowledgement that this royal woman would perform ceremonies to ensure the birth of a healthy and powerful royal heir. These rituals would thereby perform her loyalty to her family of marriage and maintain the status of her patriline by birth. Of course, one can also imagine that a royal woman forced into marriage may have refused to perform such a ritual or withheld her ceremonial skills from her husband's kin. Given that Maya queenly power is situated at the intersection of cultural norms of gender and authority, queens did not utilize a single model or script for their legitimacy, especially over vast periods of time, such as the classic period. The ideological script of gender complementarity was both utilized, as in the stela pairings, and deliberately violated, as in the portrait of an unaccompanied queen in warrior dress, as we see on the right here, during the classic period. This paradox or ambiguity is to be expected in the materialization of the social discourse about gender conceptions that occurred within a society where elite women from powerful families were able to contest the largely masculine dominance of authority. Each deviation from a gendered norm served to reinforce the norms overall. When a queen was able to deploy the resources of the state to commemorate her deviations, such as in the portraits of the Queen of Naranjo, we see that gender is neither static nor unyielding. With royal pedigree as a tool, certain Maya queens, such as Lady Yok Iknal of Palenque or Lady Wakhalam Chan Hahao of Naranjo, contested the limitations of idealized masculine authority and co-opted a definition of gender complementarity that positioned them as dominant power holders within their polities. Both a patrilineal system of kinship and much of the mythology of the classic period support a pivotal role for royal women in ensuring dynastic success. Patrilineal descent created rivalries that exogamous marriage helped to neutralize. Mythological scenes of male-female mutuality, such as dressing the maize deity, provided a script for royal women and men to perform complementary court duties. A mythology that included acknowledgement of the potency of female sexuality and reproductive potential reified the interest of the state in controlled reproduction and the obligation of royal women to uphold that value. The requirements of hereditary rule put women at the center of Maya monarchy. The sexuality of the queen was conscripted into service of the state. It was politicized and laden with symbolic importance. She was, in fact, a conduit of state power, and her symbolic value as a font of legitimacy was unmatched. And while her reproductive potential, once harnessed to a king, was a source of legitimacy for the king's patriline, her own legitimacy was fragile, since it was vested so deeply in reproductive success. For Maya queens, their ability to perform other essential ritual roles and their possession of esoteric ceremonial knowledge from their patriline of origin seem to have also offered some counterweight to the need to reproduce. But motherhood was clearly the most fundamental avenue to power. Any queen in a rigidly patriarchal descent system was vulnerable to accusations of sexual impropriety or dishonor, which would be framed as a form of dynastic disloyalty. Parentage statements are the most common means by which we know the names and lives of ancient Maya queens. Given the fact that most royal Maya marriages were arranged for political purposes, where husband and wife may not have shared any affection for one another, and that a patrilineal system generates friction and competition among male siblings, The easiest and most stable relationship within the court would have been between a queen mother and her son, or her daughter, although daughters were often sent away in marriage. This maternal connection likely contributes to the prolific number of monuments depicting a royal mother that were commissioned by her son. The mother-son bond was a touchstone of classic Maya culture that transcended generations. The invocation of the great ancestor Lady Iqnal by Pakal 2 generations after she lived, which is what we're looking at here, is a strong indication that legitimization could be achieved by commemorating, and thus laying claim to, female reproductive power in service to state-sanctioned generational succession. Queen mothers were often chosen as regents over ministers who might have personal interest, because a queen's concern for the dynasty was presumed to be the same as that of her son. Even if they did not hold the role of regent, a queen mother likely oversaw palace administrative issues, provided intelligence to the king, selected and trained members of her kin group or local faction for court positions. A queen who arrived from elsewhere produced an heir that was the beneficiary of both local and foreign dynasties, and lived a long life as queen mother was perhaps the most powerful person after the king in a Maya court. Here we can think of the Red Queen of Palenque, who arrived at Palenque from a small neighboring site, married the powerful King Pakal, birthed 2 sons, and lived a long and privileged life. The benefits to a royal woman for the correct performance as generational wellspring and reproducer of dynastic success could be quite substantial. I've stated that titles were the way in which power and authority were transferred within elite Maya society. Most mothers and wives carry a title in the hieroglyphic corpus known as the inverted vase, which has to date resisted decipherment. Maria Eugenia Gutierrez has proposed that this glyphic complex is used as an adjective that describes only certain Maya queens. Gutierrez suggests that the inverted vase is to be read as the adjective kinal, warm belly, and ishku, goddess, the warm and wet woman, i.e. the fertile woman who possesses or has demonstrated the ability to give birth and use her generative powers. Warmth as a characteristic of female reproductive power is also reflected in the modern Yucatec Maya concept of kinam, which is a variable force or heat possessed by some people more than others. The most common cause of an increase in someone's kinam today is exposure to pregnant women or sexual activity. Monitoring and controlling such a force is a community concern that helps explain the 3 perinatal rituals recorded in the colonial period books of Chilam Balam. Gutierrez's reading accords well with the emphasis placed on maternal roles as seen in the abundance of classic period parentage statements, and female reproductive power in service to the dynasty as seen in mythological art. It is quite likely that the successful production of an heir by a royal woman was status elevating, and perhaps even recorded in a title that by its presence in official script reinforced yet again the desire and need for the state to harness the awesome power of female sexuality to its needs. I think I'm going to skip this next slide. This is a queen from Naranjo. Her stela actually traveled into the United States recently, and we'll just hear in my conclusions. This presentation began with a series of questions meant to enlarge how we think about and understand indigenous Maya conceptualizations of gendered power as a mechanism of the state, specifically as it applies to the institution of queenship. I've embraced the ambiguities and paradoxes that emerge in the increasingly well-documented historical biographies of many of these extraordinary women, and view these ambiguities as evidence of the agency such women were able to exercise within classic Maya power structures. Gendered expectations intersected with the privileges of divine lineage, and some Maya queens leveraged their elite familial connections to stretch or contest those gendered expectations. Even when royal women ruled alone or as queen regnant, or carried the supreme column title of independent authoritarian rule, their structural access to power was situated within a framework of gender complementarity and patrilineal descent. Both of these social constructions emphasized royal women as guarantors of dynastic succession, whether they facilitated succession through biological or ceremonial means. In this way, royal women occupied a fundamental role in Maya systems of social domination and sovereignty. They were literally the perpetuators of political domination through the conjuration of spiritual forces and offspring who would reproduce the power structures of the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ardren. That was fascinating. Thanks for the wonderful talk. I will open this up for questions now. Does anyone have a question for Dr. Ardren about her research?
Gallery.
Kata, go ahead.
It's not a very informed question. I mean, it is informed, but let's say in a different way, because I'm not an archaeologist. But so I work on contemporary Maya culture, and I interview various Mayan intellectuals. And what I hear from them about gender in Maya culture strikes me as somewhat different from what you presented us. Somewhat, because these 14% of women in powerful roles, it would be sort of a bridge between what I'm hearing from them, which is that Maya women were more powerful than in other cultures, and that the culture of machismo, the culture of disdaining or putting down women, came with colonization. And that we also should pay attention to the fact that in Popol Vuh, the creators are not just men, but there is a creator she and creator he, right? So there is this equality. So what I'm hearing from them is that there was much more equality between men and women than it is right now, and that the colonial powers have brought. How would you react to how would you respond, or how would you reflect on this kind of
I agree completely with that perspective, and that's why I'm trying to explain to archaeologists or people who are studying the classic period the concept of gender complementarity, the fact that there's a dual gendered creator god, or male and female versions of the creator god, and that power was often vested in the partnership between a queen and a king ruling together. I feel that much of the domination of women that exists today in the Maya world is the result of colonialism and very much an introduction of European values. However, we have a database of images of rulers from the classic period, and there are not as many women as there are men. So many of my colleagues have actually really underestimated the role of women. I actually kind of feel like I agree with you 100% and have tried to bring the power of women prior to European arrival. I've tried to elevate that evidence. But I don't think, as much as I respect what my intellectuals are saying today to you, I also have to work with the evidence that I have. And so I'm trying to do both things. I am trying very much to elevate the opportunity, the idea that women held power and were authorities in their own right. And in the longer version of this chapter, there's 3 case studies of very powerful Maya queens. But the reality is we have more images of men, more names of kings, more evidence of men, and pretty strong evidence of patrilineal descent. So I think that kind of, if we can I would come down on the fact that I think, yes, women held many roles of authority, and especially spiritual authorities, but sort of political power was the majority of those leaders were male in the classic period.
Yeah, and this is what I'm hearing when I said 15% or 14%. I meant it as a large number, and
Yeah, right.
between those ideas, because in other Mesoamerican cultures, those numbers, as I understand, were much lower. And so maybe like one more question, if there is no other hands in the air. How do you see, and maybe you didn't study it that closely, but the moment, the transformation between classic to post-classic, how does it affect the power of women? I hear that women started to take over commerce more in post-classic, which additionally elevated their roles in the society. Could you comment a little bit on that?
That's a really fascinating question. And I'm not a specialist in the post-classic period, but I have given it thought. And I think, yes, one factor is that the Maya society in general shifted towards commercial bases for power. I believe that's the rationale for Chichen Itza, and then it is transformed in the rest of the post-classic period. But what I think we can see most clearly, so there's that. Then we have the images of, we have many female goddesses in the post-classic period. Many appear in the codices, many appear in the ceramic incensarios. We have actually more goddess imagery from the post-classic period than we do from the classic period, a more diverse cross-section of kind of aspects of life that are governed by these deities. So that's interesting, and nobody's really sorted that out very well. And then we have the devolution of power in general that's going on during the post-classic. So rather than being vested in the dynasties, it's now in a broader cross-section of the society, the merchants and the artisans and the traders. And so I think that probably, and this is pure speculation, empowered the domestic world to some degree in a way that it wasn't before, so that there were greater avenues towards power and influence, but less of it vested in a specific royal family or set of royal names, which is my best explanation for why we don't have the same kinds of epigraphic texts in the post-classic period, where the faith in the dynasties was just at an all-time low. And so when the Spanish arrive, there's still high status Maya families that they meet, and that there are people who have the respect of their communities as leaders, but they are not multi-generationally invested in the same sorts of power that people from the classic period enjoyed. So we know, there's fascinating 16th century records of Maya women bringing cases to court, accusing priests of corruption and abuse. They were very empowered at that moment, despite Spanish attempts to try and change things. And they inherited wealth through their families. And so there are tantalizing hints of what's happening in the post-classic. But I think that's a wonderful topic for somebody here to take on and research and make a major contribution. Yeah, Sarah?
Hi, so I have a question kind of following up on that temporal pattern, the change into the post-classic, but I'm wondering about the terminal classic and kind of the destabilization of Maya states and the breakdown of some institutions, and how you view, could it have been a sort of loss of faith in the power of state to harness female reproductive potential and sexuality? Like what is the role of queenship in the context of the decline of Maya states in the terminal classic period?
That's another fascinating question. Thank you. I personally think it's almost the reverse. I think, and this is largely by analogy to other Native American cultures in the New World, that when the formal apparatus of the state starts to unravel, whether that be through the many processes that led of the terminal classic period that led to the dissolution of state power, or whether that be during colonialism, women become the guardians of cultural tradition, right? And preservers of indigenous power bases and indigenous knowledge. So I think what's happening in the terminal classic, I mean, we see in the inscriptions of Chichen, for example, that it's local high status women that the outsiders marry when they come to found Chichen, right? The inscriptions say that there are people from outside the region who come and arrive, and they marry in women who have Yucatec Maya names and are of elite families there. And that's a pattern that continues through the colonial period and historic period, that sort of local Maya women partner with, perhaps of their own choice, perhaps not, we don't know, with foreigners who show up. And so I think, while not being an expert in everywhere in the terminal classic period, at least in the Yucatan part of the terminal classic period, I think people are trying to, there's a lot of things going on. People are trying to hold on to the power of the state, the power of urbanism. The whole idea of urbanism is wearing thin. Climate changes are exacerbating that, and overpopulation, overuse of resources is exacerbating that. Endemic warfare is exacerbating that. There are many reasons why people are choosing to sort of disengage from the apparatus of the state. And I think when they do that, what's left is kinship, right? And so the Maya state co-ops kinship in order to perpetuate dynasties, royal dynasties. But kinship is a fundamental at every level of Maya society, most indigenous societies, right? So I think that probably as people disengaged with the state, as they fled Chichen, as they decided not to move to Mayapan, as they went into rural areas prior to the arrival of the Spanish, I would guess that women actually maintained positions of authority and status because they were at the heart of the kinship network that must have been how people survived. Were able to draw on each other's resources.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question for Dr. Ardren? Students, maybe? You can put it in the chat as well, and I would be happy to read any questions that anyone has. I've got a different question in the meantime, if we can take up the time here. Regarding complementarity and female power generally, I was curious. So we're talking about royal women, mothers, wives, queens in different categories, as you mentioned at the beginning. But I was wondering about high status lineages and just, going to sort of the lower echelons or the lower status groups within Maya society. Do some of these ideas carry over in the iconography that might associate with high status households that are not royal, or palace households?
Are you asking if like the principle of complementarity extended below the most elite levels of society and into?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
To simplify it, that was, yeah.
Yeah, I think it does. I think especially when one compares Maya data to other parts of the world. So, for example, one of the things about that we know is that even at commoner households, of which there have been many excavated, the bone isotope chemistry shows that men and women ate essentially the same diet. Maybe a little bit more carbohydrate and less protein for the women, as it's been explained that they were, processing corn all day and maybe nibbling on that, but essentially they ate the same diet. So there's no strict gender hierarchy, which you do see in other cultures around the world. Likewise, in burial goods at the commoner level there are gendered patterns, but they're not dramatically different. So it's not as if the men are always buried with more wealth than the women or vice versa or something like that. There's a very consistent sort of equality across gender in terms of goods in burials. To me, both of those things indicate either a lack of emphasis on gender at the commoner level, or a relative understanding of complementarity, the benefits of both genders or both genders working together. I tend toward the latter interpretation just because I think gender is really baked into Maya culture in many ways. So I think it would have percolated all the way down. But
Thank you. Any other questions?
So if there are no other questions, are there any other questions that you see, Sarah?
Sarah, this is Fumi.
Oh,
can I?
thank you.
Sorry. I have a very basic question. Maybe it's like a common sense for everyone like listening here, but how do you how do you distinguish basically like iconography that's male and female? Because sometimes when you were showing images, sometimes I wasn't sure
no, that's fair. That's absolutely fair. There are many, we have almost a century of people arguing about some of these figures. So what's really helped is the decipherment of the epigraphic script. And now we have names that go along with some of the figures, the more complicated figures to identify. In basic, simple terms, a lot of Mesoamerican art shows people in costumes that are gender specific. So if it's a person in a big, loose, like rectangular piece of cloth, that's a female, very specifically female form of clothing. Right? And so you, in Mesoamerican art, as well as in Mesoamerican culture, when you see that piece of clothing, you are meant to think female.
Oh, so even if artifacts you're looking at are fragmented, you can sort of tell.
Right. If you have any little fragments or images of that particular piece of clothing, that's a really good clue as to the gender of the individual that's being represented. And then from there, you can pick, there are a few other things like that, right? So weaving implements. Weaving implements are very closely associated with female gender in Mesoamerica, even up to today or in Maya culture. And so when you find weaving implements in a burial, for example, or in art, it's not a huge leap to assume that they were being used by women, right? So we make a series of arguments like that based on different data points about the identity, unless we actually have like the name of somebody right there on a stela or something like that. But then what gets tricky was like I mentioned with the maize deity, sometimes you have people, you have a woman who will wear a costume that is more typically worn by men because it's a deity. It's a deity that doesn't have a specific gender, in my opinion. So that sort of the power of that deity is that it blends genders, shifts between back and forth, etc. It's kind of like that idea of a male and female creator that we also reference in Mesoamerican archaeology. So for a long time, we thought that if anybody was wearing the jade in that skirt, they had to be female. Then we switched and we're like, no, that's male because we can read the name of the king. And now we're at some point in the middle there saying that both men and women who are royals could wear this costume in specific moments when they wanted to embody the powers of the youthful male god, maize deity. And so that was something that women did and something that men did.
Very interesting.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question because it is tricky sometimes to tell. And I forget that I didn't explain that.
Do we have any more time? Can I ask a couple more questions, or are we finishing at one?
I think it's up to Dr. Ardren. We certainly can stay for a few more minutes on our end. That's no problem at all. So
sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So I have a similar question to Fumi to a certain extent about how. So during your lecture, you mentioned that women, for example, were punished for certain sexual freedoms. How can you establish that? That's one question. And another question connected to your answer about male dressed in female clothing, female dressed in male clothing, and then the genderless creatures has to do with this principle of dual unity. And I wonder if the principle of dual unity, which is part of Maya philosophy right now, is already identifiable in Mayan classic in what you're researching, and how does it show, if so?
I believe it is. I think that's what I'm calling complementarity. I think that that goes very deep in Mayan culture, and that it was a very important core value of my ideological power structures, and is expressed in mythology, is expressed in material culture through things like art and burial furniture. So I absolutely think it is essentially a version, I mean, very similar.
Okay. And about
Your first question, it was something about how do we know, that they were punished for their sexuality. That is largely the result of Maya mythology. And my use of Oswaldo Chinchilla's analysis of classic period art and colonial period mythology, right? So we don't have classic texts that describe mythology. We have the Popol Vuh, and then we have lots of colonial texts about Maya mythology. So those are all been influenced, obviously, by the values of the colonial period. And some people would say, and I know some people do feel like Oswaldo's readings of mythology are influenced too much by Spanish values that feared female sexuality. I can see the point of that, but I tend to think that he also, though, grants a lot of power to female sexuality, which almost no other scholars do. And I think that power.
Traci, I think
there are many myths that talk about a woman tempting a man, or a goddess tempting a god, or a woman becoming impregnated outside of marriage, or things like that I think are the basis for this kind of thought.
Right, but you cannot see it on the vases or on the artifacts.
No, we don't actually have anything that shows like punishment or negative consequences for sexuality. No. In fact, it's kind of the reverse, because there's some of those disrobing scenes that we don't fully understand well, but they seem to me to be an acknowledgement of the power of female sexuality in certain limited mythological contexts. Yeah.
All right, I'll just keep it going. I know I've got at least two more questions to ask. So, as a class, I teach a seminar on Mesoamerican landscapes and environments, as I was telling you, and we read your work earlier this semester on the Phalai stones in the northern Maya lowlands, and as an expression of male sexuality, and there was a discussion in that article about controlling male sexuality, and I wondered if you could just talk about the relationship between female and male sexuality and harnessing it, and the importance of controlling it, and the potential for it to be dangerous, or that it has to be sort of appropriate and controlled and in relation to the state. If that's, I don't
Sure.
know.
Thanks.
Thank you.
That's one of my favorite articles too. And you're the first person to ask me about the connection between these two studies, and whether I guess I'm giving the impression that I think about sexuality all the time. But I mean, this is the data that we have. Those Phalai stone article emerged from the fact that those stones are literally all over the place, and nobody has said anything particularly interesting about them. So, I don't think that indigenous cultures had the same the shame about the body, right? And there was a lot more sort of frank acknowledgement of the body, and that's why we have the data that we have. So I do think that I was very influenced by a book about Aztec sexuality by Pete Siegel, in which he takes a lot of looks at the mythology, looks at early colonial legal records, and offers a model that sexual behavior was neither bad nor good in Aztec society, but it was seen as powerful. And like other things, it needed to be kept in balance. And so there were appropriate ways to do that and inappropriate ways to do that. And the main goal of was to keep that energy in balance with other things in your life. And so I think that to me seems like a very indigenous perspective on sexuality. It acknowledges its power. It acknowledges the importance of reproduction. It doesn't shame people for having sexual desire, but yet it also wants to keep that sexual desire with some guardrails on it, right? And so I think that when you're talking about ancient states, and there's been a lot written about the Aztec state sort of co-opting reproduction in order to create, more Aztec warriors and more Aztec citizens, etc. I guess my particular perspective on state power is often that it is very controlling of the population, that it's very oppressive in a way, in the sense of it, in order to reproduce itself, or in order to sustain itself, it needs to shape its citizens' behavior in certain ways, right? And that's ancient Mesoamerican states had legal systems. There were consequences for actions. There were expectations of a tribute, and there were all kinds of sort of guidelines and rules that one had to follow in order to be part of these states. And so I think in both cases, maybe with the Phalli stones and then with this current work on queens, there's an acknowledgement of the power of sexuality and of the necessity of people being born and generating new members of these cultures, and then a desire to try and control how that happens to some degree, right? So that the state benefits. That's kind of the perspective. I guess I was taught by Marxists or something. It doesn't sound Marxist to me, but I think that a lot of Latin Americanists, when we look at ancient states, we see the ways in which the states took ideas that were common in the population prior to the emergence of the state, and then they just kind of magnified them. So, for example, kinship is a good one, where we know kinship was important as a structuring principle prior to the emergence of the classic Maya state. It was important after the fall of the classic Maya state, and it's a thing that gets wrapped up in the power of the state, and expressed through things like hieroglyphic inscriptions that go on and on and on about whose father and whose father and whose father and whose father and whose mother and mother and mother. All these statements that situate a particular king or queen in this massive network of kinship relations. That, to me, I read that as not just a statement of kinship, but also a statement of a person of privilege within the state power system, using these cultural tools, these cultural elements to maintain their position of privilege.
Can I
Thank you.
follow up with that?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, Fernanda.
Hi. I have to go, but I'm really glad Dr. Clayton brought up the phallic article. And now that you mentioned the importance of creating more people, I'm wondering then why not the female genitalia, or given that they are the birth givers themselves, why aren't they held to that higher standard and essentially be represented in a greater form than the other parts of it takes two to tango, but I feel like the women, of course, are the ones to typically give birth and be that reproductive force. So
Yeah.
why that might be, why it's focused maybe on the male part.
That's so great a question. And I am working now. My next thing is going to be on the shock belt, which is a spondylus shell that people, Maya scholars will say, oh, that's a representation of the womb, but nobody actually really says why or where that came from or how it connects into bigger ideas. So I am kind of talking a little bit. I don't know, I know in the Andes there's images of angry vaginas, and I would love to make that argument for the Maya, but I don't think we have that data. But I think we do have the female genitalia to some degree with these spondylus shell belts that kings and queens wear. But that's very preliminary. I'm still just thinking about that. But as to why the phalli in particular, remember in that article, and I didn't play this up a lot because it doesn't resonate outside of feminist circles very much, but there's a lot of anxiety in cultures that portray the phallus. There's often a lot of anxiety about demonstrating masculinity. It's a fragile sort of concept, and the phalli is fragile, so there's a sense that it needs to be re-emphasized over and over again. So I think that that's why the images, and again, I'm just completely spouting off here, but I think that it fits a global pattern where images of the male body are important to reinforce in elite art, because there's a sort of a sense of fragility of masculinity. Whereas female power is always vested in reproduction, which is really tangible, really visible, really obvious to most people, and doesn't then end up in the sphere of sort of elite art as much.
Wow, I really enjoyed that mentioning of the anxiety over masculinity and the expression of masculinity, and I thought that was very fascinating. So thank you very much. I have to go, but this was incredible. Thank you so much.
I've had such a good time talking to you all. If anybody has anything else, if not, feel free to email me if you have, any follow-up questions or anything. And always happy to talk about this with other people.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Dr. Ardren. There are many comments in the chat. Everyone is saying thank you, and comments from students in the course saying they enjoyed reading your work as well. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been wonderful. Let's all give Dr. Ardren a round of applause, at least with your reaction motif. All right.
Thank you so much.
Have
Bye,
a wonderful
Sarah.
afternoon.
Will
Thank you,
do.
Traci.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.